Hey, I'm Jammer. So, I'm really excited. And the reason I'm really excited is because today I'm going to be talking about a book by arguably one of the best comic book writers around. Honestly, one of my favorite comic book writers, if not one of my favorite writers, period. And if the stack behind me is not a dead giveaway, bleh, words, what are those? Then hopefully the title of the book is, because tonight we will be talking about We3 by Grant Morrison and Frank Whitley. Now, who's Grant Morrison? Well, Grant Morrison's a Scotsman, and I'm going to try to stop doing a fake Scottish accent as early as I possibly can, because there's nothing worse than an American who only thinks he can talk in a bad Scottish accent. Grant Morrison is a Scotsman. He is part of the United Kingdom, and he is is widely regarded as one of the premier comic book writers of his generation. He really got his start off in Great Britain, but then was eventually part of the, quote, British invasion in terms of the comic scene during the 1980s, which included writers like Alan Moore, who more or less just revolutionized the genre of comics. And one of the ways that Grant Morrison really brought about the change that he did was he brought the only way to describe it is he brought Grant. And I don't know how else to explain it, because if you've read a Grant Morrison comic book, it's kind of hard to forget the experience. Case in point, the stack behind me, which has replaced the usual stack, which I actually need to start slowly moving over in my actual to-read pile, is a section that stays on my bookshelf in that it is always the Grant Morrison section. And you might have actually heard about a couple of the books Grant Morrison has written. For instance, he did a run in the New 52, specifically the Action Comics. This was actually a really interesting run, too, because it brought back in an old character by the name of Mr. Mxyzptlk, which, for the record, is only one out of a million different ways to say the name of the fifth dimensional being, because there's literally no vowels in his name. Probably, though, the book Grant Morrison is most widely known for is either this one, All-Star Superman, which I promise you we will be getting to this one in the near future, because this book is just far too important and I absolutely love it and adore it. But then another interesting book that Grant has written that a lot of people really recognize him for is Arkham Asylum. This book came out right about the time of the new Batman movie, which came out about 1989, and it was such a divergent shift from what most previous Batman comic books were. This book, if you've never read it, is Batman going into Arkham Asylum, and it's essentially him going insane before basically finding his sanity again. It's crazy. And it was one of the first graphic novels I really got into when I was getting back into comics. There's several other examples of Grant Morrison. He did a very popular line on X-Men. But then here's a couple more of his action, or the other two books in his sequence on Action Comics. But then also in terms of Grant Morrison, he's widely known for his Grantness, or his oddity, which is very apparent in books like Sea Guy, which, if you don't know what that's about, just look at the title. It's about a sea guy and his floating shark buddy helping this pink squishy blob. And I really wish that wasn't the plot of the book, but it's pretty much it. There's also Sebastian O., arguably one of the gayest books I have ever read. And as a member of the queer community, and as somebody who feels a certain ethos in describing things occasionally as weapons-grade gay, please trust me when I say this book is weapons-grade gay and really weird and surreal. There's also a very popular work by the name of Flex Mentallo. This is more or less Grant Morrison's kind of autobiography of him basically finding God or spirituality through comic books. There's Happy, which I actually brought up in my very first video for this channel, which again is about an ex-cop who suddenly gets harassed by a floating blue unicorn named Happy, who's the imaginary friend of a little girl who's been kidnapped. Nameless is one of his most recent books, and honestly, I'm not going to try to even describe the plot of Nameless because it's too wacky and weird, but hopefully sometime in the future we'll get to it. But arguably, the book which brought Grant a lot of the big attention was this book, Doom Patrol. And as you can see, I have two of the three-part collections, and then, move my tripod even, this massive omnibus. And when I say massive, it is massive. It is a huge, dense read filled with esoteric content, the arcane, the occult. There is a gender fluid street named Danny, as in like a street, and his name is Danny, and he's fabulous. There's Crazy Jane, who has more than about 10,000 different personalities. And then, of course, there's the main character, Clint, who is a man who has suffered a catastrophic loss of his body and is inside of a robot. And if you might have heard of Doom Patrol because DC's streaming service actually did a supposedly really good version of this book. I haven't watched it myself because I don't really watch that much TV, but I have two friends who regularly do, and they have informed me that it's magnificent. If you get the chance to read Doom Patrol, do it, because I have never seen a perfect end to a comic book until I read this book. But okay, Grant Morrison has clearly written a lot of books, and a lot of them are really weird. So, what does that have to do with what we're talking about today? Well, again, if I can move this mountain back into place. There we are. Thank you, Grant. Again, the book tonight is We3, which follows up in a lot of the weirdness and oddity that is Grant Morrison, and the fact that the book is about three animals, a cat, a dog, and a rabbit, all of them more or less lost pets that have been warped and tortured and more or less reappropriated by the government into living super soldiers. You can see the outer exterior that they're wearing here is essentially armor that's also decked out to have various weapons capabilities. The general plot line of the book is that these three animals are eventually decided that, you know what, they've served their purpose, they've gotten to the end of their rope, it's time that we terminate them. The scientist that's been working with them, however, goes, but these are animals, we can't just do that. We can't just do all this to them and then just put them down. To which case says the military says, don't really care. And so, out of a moment of conscience, the scientist releases these three, and then the rest of the book is nothing but 1, 2, and 3, that's literally their names, escaping the military, trying to find their way home. And if the story of three animals that have been tortured by the government turned into lethal weapons trying to find their way home doesn't sound like the metal version of Homeward Bound, I don't really have much else to say to you because this kind of is the heavy metal version of Homeward Bound, but even more sad and happy at the same time somehow. But anyway, what we're working with here is a very science fiction book. And so when you're looking into this book, take in consideration that Grant is going to be working with a lot of key ideas of government conspiracy, government manipulation, which is all very in keeping with a lot of aspects of Grant Morrison's life. But this general summation of the book is important when we consider how this book contributes to the overall form of comics, which I'll go ahead and get into now. Okay, so we know generally We3 what it's about. It's about three animals that are trying to escape from the violent, more or less torture and reappropriation of their bodies by the military. Again, the book is primarily about the concept of these three animals which have been developed by the military for the purpose of, again, general operations, or more importantly, tactical operations. The book itself actually opens up with their role in an actual assassination of... It's either supposed to be that he's a drug dealer or that he is more or less a political enemy of the United States, potentially even a military enemy of the United States. We get several sequences in this opening passage of the man in question more or less becoming paranoid, and we see small little bits of the three as they make their way up to the man's room. We see him shoot, he doesn't see anything, and then the next 2-page spread is something that's actually quite interesting. It takes a minute or two to really see it, but what this 2-page spread actually is the viewer basically being shot at. So what we're doing here is we're seeing bullets perforating this man's body at virtually every surface, but more importantly, Quigley has purposely arranged the shot so that we get a close-up of these bullets cutting through. And this isn't a unique aspect of this one opening sequence. Throughout the book, violence is not personalized, but honed into a very specific set of sequences. For example, in a later passage, after the three have escaped from the military bunker where they're about to be decommissioned, aka killed, we get a sequence in which there are helicopter pilots chasing after them, as well as members of the military and armed services trying to catch them, and the cat, aka 2, uses her claws. But again, what's really unique is, first off, this panel design, this panel layout is simply incredible. The eye kind of struggles at first, trying to figure out in what direction am I supposed to move, but really what's excellent about this is this 2-page spread has numerous numerous panels, but really you have 2 panels and then these sub-panels, which, again, as you get into it, you begin to observe, again, we see bullets moving in, bullets go out the man's skull, and we can see a before and after of the bullets in this particular instance. And then with the cat has its claws, which are very high-speed projectile needles. And so you can see in some of these panels as bodies are perforated very meticulously and sharply. Violence is a key element of this book because, again, the whole focus of these creatures is the fact that they were designed to be military tools and equipment. But even more than just the violence that the three use against each other, it's important and interesting to observe how violence is also acted against the three as they continue to make their way towards the city and then eventually home, aka some kind of refuge. And one of the most beautiful and also heartbreaking passages, and I probably should forewarn you at this point now, this might be triggering to some people if you have problems with animal violence. I do, and I still find this book really beautiful, and I'm glad I read it, but even I have to admit I cried when there's a passage when 3, the rabbit, has his tail broken, and he eventually encounters a father and son out on a hunting trip. Also, you'll note words coming from 3. The way it works is the animals can actually talk. It's part of their kind of restructuring processing. So 3 comes up, says, boss, fix, tail. Again, an interesting aspect of the dialogue is how Grant structures it so that the 3 can usually only speak in 3-word intervals. He says, fix, tail, home, now eat. The man raises his firearm, and we get this haunting page. Again, I'm really sorry if animals being hurt really hurts you. Again, this page hurt me too because I absolutely love 3, and I really hate it. But that's something that I'm going to get into here in a bit when I talk about kind of like a summation of why I feel that this book is really important critically. But moving forward with the book, the 3 eventually encounter this man. He's a man experiencing homelessness. You'll note right here, they're not looking so good. Obviously, 3's not good because he's got a hole in his head. But an interesting part of the book is that the 3 require regular medicine in order to maintain their health. And after a while, the military realizes, okay, they're not just going to die on their own. Well, in the book, they eventually encounter this gentleman who is one of the only human beings they meet who is legitimately nice to them. And again, in terms of panel design, in terms of the form of comics, this interaction is interesting because the 3 watch him approach the end of the alley where the military and the police are waiting for him. And you'll observe, first off, there's an interesting aspect with perspective and kind of horizon. If you don't know what like the horizon concept in art is, It's usually, you're probably aware of it even if you don't realize it. If you ever look out at the ocean, or if you ever look at a road down like a long stretch, at some point the road starts to narrow and narrow and narrow the farther away from the target that you are. What that means for artists is when you're trying to create three-dimensional perspective in a book, you have to understand that the further away from the viewer, the smaller objects are going to be, and the visual of them are going to be warped by your perspective. Again, it's a little detail, but if you look at just this one panel here, as this man is walking away from the three, there's a really nice perspective shot in terms of this man getting to the end of the alley where he could potentially sell the three out to his favor. But instead, we see here this panel right here where he's kind of divvied up between these little slices, these mirror frames. And the reader at this point, I'll be honest, at first, and even right now, I'm still not entirely sure what it's trying to do. For my own part, I think what these panels are supposed to be suggesting, I think they're trying to create a dramatic tension as you worry, oh God, is he going to sell 1, 2, and 3 out to the cops? Or is this 1, 2, and 3 carefully inspecting him to make sure that he's not a threat to them? Which, of course, the cops try to offer a lot of money to him, a lot of food to him, and he responds with, but nah. Nah, I seen nothing, you fascist pig assholes. So this man, right off the bat, does something that I'm going to talk about here in a bit, which is empathy. Now, again, that sequence of panels is really good because, again, we're always worried about the form on this channel. It's not just what interesting things are the story is doing, also, how does the form contribute to the story? So in just that one little passage right there, you can kind of see what Morrison and Quitley are doing. Again, the story is predominantly about the emotion of seeing these three animals who have experienced so much unnecessary pain, so much agony, and just so much manipulation, finally receiving an ounce of empathy from another human being. Again, 3 is shot in the head simply because he tries to approach a man, and the violence used in terms of his termination, or at least the shot to his head, is not just a really powerful scene emotionally because of the content, it's also really powerful in the way that Quitley and Morrison frame the actual shot themselves, because at that point, we see the buildup of tension. These long, thin, parallel panels create a moment of dramatic tension, and then it's released, much the way this blood is, in just one single panel. And I also have to talk about another aspect as well. One of the interesting things about Frank Quitley's artwork is that he has a really finite attention to detail. Looking at just the blood splatter coming off of 3's head, I know it's hard to look at, but really the way the blood projects up and out and towards the reader is a unique, strong visual. Now, another aspect of panel design I kind of skipped over at the very beginning, but after it's been made clear that the 3 are to be terminated, their leading scientist, of course, I can't remember her name. Oh yes, Dr. Barry. Okay. Dr. Barry. So difficult to remember. Anyway, Dr. Barry eventually realizes what she has done to these animals and what role she must play now in terms of giving them anything in the way of salvation. The reader is given 3 pages. Again, the 3 seems to be kind of like a recurring theme. Can't imagine why. But anyway, we see 3 pages, and from afar, it may not seem terribly great, but what's truly brilliant about these pages is the fact that each one of them contains a small, crucial detail that eventually leads up to the escape. So we see 1 page, 2 pages, and then 3. And again, if you're paying really close attention, I know I'm probably moving it pretty quickly, and ceiling light isn't always the best help here, but you can see a lot of small details in the security camera footage. This is actually a pretty old trick that sometimes comic artists have used to great effect. Holding cameras still in one place and then doing the same shot next to each other, next to each other, next to each other, and then slowly adding a small detail over and over and over again can have a really powerful effect on the reader. And when we consider this, the escape, it's ultimately followed by this beautiful two-page spread. Again, one of the sort of consistent strengths of this book is that Quitely is at top form as an artist, framing these panels in such a way so that they have a powerful emotional resonance, so that this isn't just a sci-fi story about three animals in badass armor fighting the military, what have you. There's a real attention paid to how the emotions taking place can ultimately impact the viewer. Now, again, looking at the violence in this book, what's really interesting and powerful to me is the way that action is portrayed. So at one point, weapons program number 4, aka a gigantic bulldog in full armor who's been force-fed steroids that makes him extra angry and perky, eventually finds the three and is launched against them as a means of attack. And as we look at this fight sequence again, what's fascinating is subtle motions of line, color, and form are used to create the feeling that action is happening, that things are moving about. Now, again, I apologize for the violence, but again, violence plays a really crucial part in this book. We can see just how these small motions are made to eventually create the powers that be. And perhaps maybe one more page that I think is really, really useful. Let's see. This two-page spread here, where Weapon System 4 ultimately crashes onto a major highway and actually is about to attack police officers, we can see the attempt is to use more or less the same long horizontal panel structure to show a lot of events happening quickly. We see the animals landing on top of cars, we see police pulling up, we see police firing on Weapon System 4, and then it's kind of difficult to see, but right here, Number 1 saves a police officer and professes himself to be a good dog, which made me put the book down and go hug my dog Huckleberry because I'm a pansy. But I know what I'm about. Finally, one of the interesting things to me about this book is the fact that 3 dies. Sorry, spoilers. But 1 and 2 do ultimately make it, and far more importantly, they escape from their captors, finding refuge in the company of the homeless man who originally basically fought for them. And the reader gets this really nice, well, let's see, 6, 12, well, actually, no. If you look at it, this is an 11-panel spread, because you've got 6 on this side, 5 on this side. And again, the panels have sort of slowed down a little bit, where before there was a lot of dramatic sequences and 2-page spreads to kind of highlight the volatility and the action taking place. We come now to the end of this book. The head scientist behind the program is about to have to speak before Congress. His life is basically ruined. But he recognizes 1 and 2, and he realizes at this point this is some manner of option for redemption. And so the reader follows him to ultimately giving basically all the contents of his wallet to this man so that he can feed the pets before walking into oblivion. Okay. Honestly, I don't think I really need to show much more to you to demonstrate why visually and like just sort of compositionally why this book is so important. Now I'm going to talk just a little bit about empathy and why I think that's the reason why this book is worth your time. Okay, So we've got to the fact that We3 is a gorgeous book, and it's a visually stunning book from beginning to end, and it's not that long a book either, so this thing really doesn't take that long to read. You could probably honestly sit down and finish it in an hour if you wanted to, though I would encourage you to take your time, just read one story a day or one chapter a day, because stretching this book out really helps you become more and more attached to the journey that these characters go through. Now, it must be asked at this moment, what is the central crux or what is the narrative function of this book? It's empathy. Again, as I noted in the very end of the book, one of the interesting things is the fact that the scientist who was responsible for this entire program demonstrates empathy to these animals at the very end. Throughout this entire book, he's demonstrated absolutely no empathy whatsoever. In fact, one of the earlier passages has him basically using modified rats, and modified in the fact of adding drill bits and wrenches to their heads as a way of taking out the three. And when he's actually initially speaking with Dr. Barry, of course, I can't find that passage. This is why, boys and girls, you mark chapters before you actually get around to it. But whatever the case. Oh, yes. There's this small passage here where he's attempting to alert the military, and he's trying to chastise Dr. Barry for letting the three loose. He says, they just don't understand what we've made here. Those poor men, see what you've done. Oh, those poor men. He understands fully and completely that those men are about to die. And in this 2-page spread, which I can't believe I didn't show to you because, oh my gosh, it's gorgeous, you can see just to what extent the three are capable of in terms of physical violence. And empathy needs to be demonstrated to the soldiers who are given their lives to try to defend their country, their families, their communities. But at the same time, there's a great level of what's known as cognitive dissonance. That's believing or saying one thing and then doing the exact opposite. It's almost irony. It's basically like me saying, people who litter are awful human beings, and then just like throwing the can into a creek. That's cognitive dissonance. The scientists in this book and the military in this book demonstrate a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance because they're continually talking about the We3 program is a way of saving human lives. And in some ways, there's a real problem here because this book feels really believable. It seems far more likely that if the military was trying to create super soldiers, they would begin with animals first, predominantly because if it was found out that people were torturing animals, or if they were doing this to animals as opposed to human beings, the blowback may be not as severe. Because whether we like it or not, there's a great amount of people that don't have empathy for animals. Now, those people are rat bastards and I hate them, but the point still stands. Now, what is empathy? Because empathy and sympathy are two very important things. I can sympathize with a human being who's experiencing pain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I understand that pain. If you suffer from depression, however, and somebody also suffers from depression, you can potentially empathize with that human being because you know what it's like. But that necessarily doesn't stop you if you don't suffer from depression, because if you try to understand what that person experiences emotionally, it's an attempt at empathy. So really what I'm trying to get to you is that one of the most important aspects of We3 is you have to try to demonstrate empathy, because these are three animals, and the beginning of the first 3 chapters, we really feel that because they begin with the missing posters that these animals' families put up. The dog's name was Bandit. Let me get to the cat. Ginger striped cat. His name is Tinker. Kind of looks like my cat Tommy or my other ginger cat Jones. And then finally we also get, and this one will just kill you dead, this sweet little missing poster for Pirate the Bunny. These are three animals that had homes, that had families that loved them. And they were stolen, appropriated, tortured, manipulated, and then eventually turned into real living weapons. And on the one hand, there's definitely an aspect, or kind of like an old Yeller situation, where it's like, oh, why do they have to do that to animals? It's so sad. It's like horse movies and dog movies. Why do they make dog movies? Seriously, why do they make dog movies? There's no good reason to make me cry unnecessarily. Anyway, I definitely see how it could be written off as just yet another cheap animal movie designed to just instill a lot of emotion in the reader. But having begun to read a lot of the life of Grant Morrison and his life, one of the most important aspects of his work and career is the fact that he tremendously loves comics and he loves the characters in comics. And he wants to instill that love to his reader. So even if his stories seem predominantly weird, it's again an energy that's trying to get you to love and care about these characters. And hopefully if you read this book, it really doesn't take that much effort to fall in love with these three. 1, 2, and 3 didn't deserve this. Or, truthfully, Bandit, Tinker, and Pirate didn't deserve this. And that's kind of the point. If we're willing to acknowledge that 3 innocent animals, and I use the word innocent carefully because I honestly don't like the word, but these 3 organisms that didn't volunteer for any of this got caught up and manipulated and hurt, all in the name of making sure that nobody gets hurt. It's not really fair. Life isn't fair, but at the same time, it also isn't just. And so I think creatively, what's really important about We3 is its plausibility, but then more importantly, its insistence to the reader, or at least its plea to the reader, hey, I get it's animals, so it's not the same as a human being, but at the same time, these are animals that come into our life, they live alongside us. And if the movie John Wick didn't prove how crazy people can act towards their pets, just appreciate the fact that this book is a really interesting meditation on why empathy is important, because more than anything else, empathy can prevent real-life suffering. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for watching me geek out. I promise I'm going to do this every single time we do a Grant Morrison book, because I just love Grant Morrison so much. He's so awesome. I'll stop. Anyway, if you liked this book, definitely check out your local comic book shop. As always, I'll try to post a link to my local comic book shop, Ground Zero. I think they have a copy of this. It's a Vertigo title, so you should probably be able to get to it. I know Vertigo is, technically speaking, no longer around, but if your local comic book shop can't get a hold of it, I would definitely recommend check out your local public library, because if they don't have it, they can probably get it to you on an interlibrary loan. In the description section below, I will post a link to a documentary on YouTube that's all about Grant Morrison. I'm right in the middle of watching it, and I would actually really encourage you to check it out, because if this book hasn't kind of informed you that Grant Morrison is crazy and that I'm crazy, but I don't care because I love Grant Morrison, it's definitely worth checking out, because his writing is kind of bizarre and weird and strange, but the man is a true nerd at heart, and he bleeds comics. And so if you like comics, he's definitely worth your time. Thank you again so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe, all that claptrap. Leave a comment. It helps let me know that you're actually watching it and you're enjoying these. And as always, hey, go read some comics.